hope you could allow me to use the privilege as the moderator of the event. I'm going to do a little bit of promotion for JCPA and the event series. So let me quickly share the screen. So good evening, good morning, good afternoon for everyone from around the world. Thank you for making the time to join us for the second ICPA Society virtual lecture series in comparative public policy. The theme of the lecture today is a dialogue on the comparative methods in research and practice. Before I introduce our panelists today, as I said, just to remind everybody that this event is organized by the Journal of Comparative Policy Analysis, as well as the affiliated Society for International Comparative Policy Analysis, and alongside with the School of Public Policy Management at Tsinghua University, which is currently the host for JCPA. As a lot of our old friends know, that JCPA was founded by Professor Iris Gilvermay in 1998, specifically to promote the field of comparative policy analysis. And so you are welcome to scan the code and to check our journal website, as well as our society's website, to get to know more about the journal, what we have been publishing in the recent years, and specifically the new special sections that JCPA started in recent years. And we also, I'm sorry. In addition to our website, we do have a number of social media channels where we frequently share our recent activities, our new articles, our and other materials. So you're welcome to check our X account, LinkedIn, YouTube, Facebook. And since we the Tsinghua editorial office is based in China, so we do have a WeChat account, which we also promote our articles and events. So you're welcome to follow our social media account and check our websites for events. So back to our event today. This is an event that we have been discussing for a long time. And particularly in the context that recent years, we have noticed that JCPA has received an increasing number of submissions that have adopted a wide range of methods, methodologies in their comparative policy analysis. And so I thought it would be great to invite the three leading and forerunners of comparative policy analysis to share with us their insights into comparative policy analysis as both a epistemology and methodology, and also the kinds of method, the variety of methods that have been used in this field. So today we are honored to have Professor Iris Gilvermay, who is the founding editor-in-chief of JCPA and also founding president of the ICPA Society. Professor Iris Gilvermay is also a professor emerita at Simon Fraser University, and also a distinguished visiting professor at Tsinghua SPPM. We're also honored to have Professor Guillaume Fountain to join us. He is currently the director and professor of Comparative Policy Lab at Flasco Kyoto, and also currently the JCPA executive editor for Latin America. I would like to specifically point out that Iris and Guillaume are currently working on a book, which is forthcoming this year, on the specific methods and methodology in comparative policy analysis. So I'm sure they will be sharing their recent insights and suggestions for us to conduct comparative policy analysis. And last but not the least, we are honored to have Professor Guy Peters to join us as well today. Professor Guy Peters is a professor of government at University of Pittsburgh and is also a JCPA former co-editor and a honorary founding editorial board member of JCPA. So we are very, very honored to have all three leading scholars to share their insights. So let me stop the sharing. So we have about an hour, slightly over an hour for our session today. So what we are going to do is we are going to invite Professor Guillaume Fountain to speak first. And I suspect it's going to be related to the forthcoming book. And then and to have also Professor Guy Peters to speak second, and also then Professor Iris Givamay to be the third speaker. Each speaker will talk for about 15 minutes so that we can still have maybe half an hour open discussion with the audience. So okay. So without further ado, let's welcome Professor Guillaume Fountain to talk about his insights into methodologies in comparative policy analysis. So, Guillaume.
Hello, everyone. Thank you, Xiling, for this very nice introduction. So I will briefly present myself. I've been working from Quito at the Latin America Faculty of Social Sciences, where I've been conducting a series of comparative researches in not only in public policy, also in social movements. I've been working on oil conflicts in the Amazon, and for the past 10 years, I've been working on several public policies like energy transition, risk in the electrical sector, chronic child malnutrition, and now I'm working on anti-corruption. But I'm not working exactly in the region. My universe, let's say, is the OECD. So some countries from Latin America are part of the OECD, Chile, Colombia, among others. But I am more focused on particularly the Asian region after the 1997 crisis. That being said, I'm also very, very involved in any kind of methodological discussion, which is how I got to start working with Iris and Guy. We published a special issue of the JCPA some 10 years ago, I think, about policy change in Latin America. And we were precisely developing a series of topics regarding the kind of corruption, the kind of comparison, sorry, that's a lapsus. There's also a lot of corruption in Latin America, so maybe we could do some research and comparative about that. But can somebody? Okay, I see the quiz is popping up, and I can't get rid of it. So we just delivered a manuscript with Iris, and the guy accepted to write the foreword on comparative policy analysis today. And the idea is not that I'm presenting the book, but I'm just trying to make a starting point. The idea is to combine historical perspective That is to see how the field has been evolving for the past 3 to 4 decades, and the current methodological challenges that we're facing. So maybe I will start with a very brief example. If you can see my screen, or do I need to share the screen? Yeah, I'm going to share it.
Yes, I believe so.
Okay, I'm going to share it a few
Yeah, we're
minutes.
good. Yeah,
So
we're
you
good.
can see a graph here where I'll try to make it a bit wider, where you can see a sample of 144 articles from the JCPA. That's part of the conclusions of the book, where we focused exclusively on papers, articles that had a particular paid particular attention to the research design, so that the methods are explicit here, and that's the point. And you can see from that sample that nearly half of the, no, exactly half of the sample comes from analytical and descriptive statistics. That is what is usually called quantitative methods. I'll come back to that. The rest is divided between small n comparison, about 20%, and a few short sections like experimental methods. Only 6% of our papers are based on experiments or equivalents, no? Quasi-experiments or randomized control trials. And we still have a pretty big part of within case studies. So some might wonder what within case studies do in a comparative journal. And as a matter of fact, it's a very interesting technique that we've been using for many years as part of collections of case studies. I'll come back to that. And last but not least, we have 14% of what is basically paired comparison or forced paired comparison. Paired comparison is basically case-to-case comparison, and forced paired comparison is basically when you choose 3 cases randomly because somebody knows some country and you're interested in comparing your country with this one. So that's something of the diversity of methods that we have, and that allows us to understand where we come from. So my presentation in the 10 minutes I would like to talk will try to answer 5 questions regarding the why comparing, the what comparing, the where we compare, and the how we compare. And I'll close with a very short section on who compares. So why? I think it's basically the core of the discussion, because although it's like the elephant in the room, many studies are actually interested in answering causal questions. So why does something happen? But the thing is that there are actually 2 meanings behind this why. The one is probabilistic, and it refers to some kind of probability that the causal relationship should be proven or explained. Like you say, I don't know, why do we lose elections? Why policy fails, etc. The other one is more like a deterministic model of causation. That is, for example, why men can't be pregnant. And obviously, these 2, we'll say ontologies, forgive the redundant word, actually refer to many, many different techniques and many, many different paths on the way towards analyzing policies and solving policy problems. So behind that, there's a what. And the what is precisely what we don't discuss enough when we talk about methods, because we take it for granted. And specifically in policy analysis, maybe that's not the problem in other disciplines from the social sciences, but in policy analysis, we tend to focus like on the case effect. For example, we focus on policy diffusion or implementation gaps, or for my part, corruption control. let's say, civic culture, for just to widen the discussion. But the thing is that behind each topic, we should actually wonder why there is a relation and what is caused by what, or what causes what. What is caused by what is we know the outcome and we look for the cause. What causes what is a totally different reasoning, especially in social sciences, because systems are open. So it's very difficult to know everything that is caused by something, which is basically the looking for the outcome of a cause or the effect of a cause. And there are obviously many different techniques to answer that question. So when we talk about policy diffusion, for example, we should wonder both why is a policy adopted, for let's say chronic child malnutrition, and we search the causes for that. And obviously the answer will not be straightforward because there are an infinity of causes for why a government would adopt a policy. The only thing we can find are middle range theories that explain us how, for example, the UNICEF is diffusing a model of public policy in that area. Now, very different is the question why policy are diffused, or why some countries try to spread out their policies, because it's obviously something very, very open. There is not a single model of explanation. That would be probably one kind of model if we think about how the European countries adopt a model that would be basically common to every country in the European Union. And just not to take a very far away example, this would be probably very, very different from the question of why OECD countries are spreading out policies. Because the channels, because the mechanisms are very different. So that leads me to the where. And the where is essentially the level of comparison. When we talk about comparison, generally speaking, we think immediately in cross-country comparison. And by the way, my examples are all cross-country comparison, so I'm also a prey of that facility. But as a matter of fact, there are two other very important levels of comparison that need to be understood and that also face different challenges. The subnational level, that is how a same program, is implemented at different local level or subnational level, would probably lead to find different kind of explanations of policy failure or implementation gap or success, probably because there are specific intervening variables or factors at the local level that we would not see at the national level, or that we would probably overlook at the national level because we're interested in a different kind of data. And the third level is the cross-sectorial level, which is a very interesting level to compare, because it is where we can actually test middle range theories. When we see the way, for example, we overcome an implementation gap in education or in health, it's very interesting because there are so many differences between health and education, although they're both social policies, that if we manage to, for example, overcome that kind of gap, it would probably give us a very strong theory of the causal model. Now, the last couple of minutes I would like to dedicate to the how, but I won't get too much into details because I know Guy will dig deeper in that matter. The how is probably the most misunderstood part of the methodological discussion, because there are actually two levels of how. And if you want something very interesting, I recommend you start with the discussion with Hillary and Russo about causality in social sciences. They both come from health, so it's interesting because they have another culture. And they make that difference between the how you prove a general relation and the how you find information to prove this general relation. That's what they call the Russo-Williamson paradox. So that, what does that mean? That means that when you think about the, let's say, the research design, the way you prove a causal relationship is the middle or high level of abstraction. And that's not to be neither qualitative nor quantitative. It's generally mixed or multi. But the way you find information and the kind of information, the kind of data you look for to prove that kind of theory or to test that kind of theory is either quantitative or qualitative. And generally speaking, in public policy, I'm thinking of the most recent book by Wiebel and Workman, Methods of the Policy Process. People immediately think about techniques to raise data, to find data, but they don't think before, and that's obviously key, and I hope I managed to make my point, of within which kind of framework we are working, whether it is a probabilistic model of causation or a deterministic model of causation, it will change everything. That is the importance of statistics, the importance of experiments, and the importance of what we call the comparative method, which is the title of this conference. So the how, I think, maybe has been very, very well treated by Aaron Lischwart, who talks about 4 methods, not necessarily of comparison, but of scientific inquiry. And like Swanson said, there's no scientific inquiry without comparison. So I will just stick to that other general affirmation or argument. And I just describe the 4 methods that Lischwart identify and which are hierarchical. So probably the most robust methods or set of methods are the experimental ones. Then come the statistics. Then come what he calls the comparative method, and I think we'll hear about that in a few seconds. And finally, the within case studies or case studies. So the thing is to distinguish those 4 methods as research design and not only as techniques to raise information. Because I think the techniques to raise information are essentially let's say, process tracing, ethnography, randomized control trials applied to some kind of specific unit of observation, and so on and so forth. So I will just, before I conclude, show you the graph we've been elaborating for the book. And that would be the, if I don't know if you can see it. It's a little.
Yeah, that looks good.
Yeah. There, I found that. Okay, there you are. So when we start with those 2 big ontologies of causation, we have a set of probabilistic approaches and a set of deterministic approaches, which lead to the 4 levels of research designs by Lischwart: experimental methods, statistical methods, what I call comparative methods, and I put an S, and that's, I think, a very important point, and case study methods. And here I put some examples of techniques that are usually used to conduct experiments, statistic analysis, etc. So when we speak about experimental methods, the first idea is randomized control trial techniques or quasi-experiments, etc. Statistics generally became, in public policy analysis, a synonym for evidence-based policy or evidence-based decision-making. When we speak about comparative methods, today, the probably most robust techniques are the techniques of qualitative comparative analysis or configurational analysis, QCA. And when we speak about case study methods, the techniques are usually process tracing. Forgive me, there's a small mistake here, process with double S. which try to trace causal processes and to describe causal mechanisms. So the techniques can be used in other designs. They can be combined, but I'm just figuring out the dominant techniques that have been used in each kind of method identified or theorized by Lee-Schwartz. So in conclusion, I think we also need to think about who compares, because there are very different publics and stakeholders in the field, and they are actually quite present in the journal. And I've distinguished four kind of stakeholders. The first one, obviously, is the academy, so students, researchers, scholars, etc. And I think we generally tend to compare with some kind of theoretical interest, or we're trying to think things through beyond the mere problem solving. A second category, which has been emerging for the past 40 years, are the think tanks, and many non-academic but highly qualified researchers who are trying to work on a more specific area or specific policy problems. The third category, obviously, is government and the public sector, or civil servants. And they use, obviously, different techniques to answer those questions, the why questions. And finally, I think we need to pay attention to what member of the parliament attend to do when they compare, because it is not the same thing to bring up, let's say, a legislative commission to prepare a law or a bill, as it is to evaluate the impact of a policy, as it is to test, let's say, the advocacy coalition framework, as it is to explain why the far right is expanding in the European Union, and populism is researching in the Occidental world for the past 20 years. These are precisely the what, and I think the what are hierarchized by the who. Not everyone is interested in the same degree with everything. And we need to think through the best methods to think about who is investigating, who is researching or investigating which topic, which subject, so that we can have a major impact and maybe be stronger in our methods and probably have better ideas. So I will conclude my presentation here. Thank you very much for your attention, and I hope we can have a small discussion afterwards.
Thank you, Guillaume, for giving a wonderful overview of really the 5 elements of comparison, and also sort of the 2 different thinkings toward comparison, probabilistic and also the deterministic, and the 4 types of 4 groups of comparative methods. So let's now move on to our second speaker, Professor Guy Peters.
Okay, can you hear me then?
Yeah.
Okay, good. Okay, well, thanks very much for the invitation to be with you today. And it's always a pleasure to follow Guillaume and to try to pick up some points that he didn't have time to deal with. So I want to begin with what I would sort of the basic litany, or the basic rule for trying to do social science research, and particularly comparative research. And that is to maximize experimental variance, to minimize error variance, and to control for extraneous variance. So, I mean, all this is sort of in positivist language, but we'll get the point. So the notion here, first of all, experimental variance is the variance you're interested in. It's what Guillaume was talking about, is when you're trying to explain some dependent variable or phenomenon. So you want to find how X and Y are related in reality. Okay. Okay. Error variance is just that, it's error. You write down the wrong numbers. You're doing interviews and you're not a very good interviewer, and you don't get good results, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. So there are any number of sources of error that enter into our research. And then finally, extraneous variance is the variance which is perhaps most important for comparative research, because this is the influence of any number of other variables out there that may have some influence on your dependent variable. So what you're talking about is if you find a relationship between X and Y, your independent and your dependent variable, they may both be related to Z, some unmeasured, unknown, extraneous variable. So what you found is totally meaningless, it's spurious, because you haven't gotten rid of the effect of that other variable. So when we do regression equations, you throw in all the usual suspects of GDP per capita, et cetera, to try to get rid of that extraneous variance, so that in fact you can say that what you find is a quote unquote true relationship between some independent and some dependent variable. Okay, so that's what research design is really about, is to try to do those three things, particularly the first and the last, that is the experimental variance and the extraneous variance. So that's what all the things that Leipart was talking about then for his research, for research designs, are all means of trying to do just that thing. And for comparative research, one of the most important aspects of those dealing with those issues is case selection. So if we're doing comparative research, we're using the comparative method as Leipart described it, that is, we're dealing with a limited number of cases, and we select those cases in order to try to control variance and to maximize the experimental variance. So if we're doing a comparative research in that way, not the statistical, not the probabilistic, but more case-based, then case selection is a crucial part of the process. and it's general, I think, as Guillaume implied, we often do this rather poorly. As we choose cases where we speak the language or that we know. We do cases for countries we want to visit, or where our girlfriend or boyfriend happens to live at the moment. So we sometimes pick up cases for all the wrong reasons. And sometimes our selection of cases is done by the availability of data. So a couple of years ago, when we were interviewing candidates for a job at Pitt, one of the individuals involved began his talk with saying, "I found some data." And he didn't have a research question, but he just had some data. So then he had to figure out what to do with it. So again, you're selecting cases not for any good scientific reason, but simply for the availability. So we often do a very poor job of case selection. Now, if we go from Leipart to Tooney and Przeworski, again, sort of classics in comparative studies, we have this fundamental difference between most similar systems designs and most different systems designs. Most of what people do with comparative research are most similar systems designs. That is, we try to pick cases that are alike and see if there's any difference in the outcomes. And in part, again, this is convenience. We speak the language. So if you're doing word search in Latin America, if you can speak Spanish and Portuguese, you've got a lot of the language problem solved. So it's easier to do those than perhaps to think about other cases in the global South, which may involve English or French or whatever. Okay, so most similar systems design is what most people do. If you look at most comparative research, a lot of it is simply taking cases that are most similar and trying to figure out why different, if there are different outcomes. The other option, which is used less frequently, is most different systems designs. And here the idea is to pick cases that are wildly different from one another as you can find. So the argument that Tooney and Jaworski were making was that if you use most different systems designs, then any relationship you find between an X and a Y is less likely to be influenced by those extraneous variables, because they're essentially are random. So you have, there's almost de facto randomize them. That's a bit of a heroic argument, but it's been, I think, an important argument in trying to do comparative research. But of course, who's different, most similar, and most different depends upon the question that you're asking. Example, if you think about Sweden and Denmark, two Scandinavian countries, okay, we tend to think of those as being most similar cases. So they're parliamentary democracies, welfare states, corporatist backgrounds, populated by tall, blonde Lutherans. So they have a lot of things that are alike, okay? But if we want to think about the way in which their governments work, there are a number of very important differences, particularly in terms of the way in which the power of ministers vis-a-vis the prime minister. So in those cases, they might in fact be most different systems designs or most different systems. So our question to some extent determines what's most similar and most different. And we have to be careful about that. Okay, now most similar systems designs are purposive. That is, the researcher is completely purposive. He or she goes out to find some similar cases and to do research in them to compare how things work, usually using other case study methods like process tracing. Most different systems designs are more deductive. They're trying to figure out, does X explain Y, when you get rid of all the other extraneous factors. So the most similar systems designs uses case selection as the means for getting rid of the extraneous variance. You have everything as much as possible similar between them. Now, and another problem that arises with case selection, I think we have to be cognizant of in comparative policy research, is sampling on the dependent variable, which is something we always are tempted to do. So in other words, we're interested in successful welfare states. Okay, so what do? We take a selection of 6 successful welfare states to find out what made them successful. Now, problem here is that you really know nothing when you finish, or at least the hardcore comparativists would argue. Barbara Geddes said that sampling on the dependent variable is an inferential felony. It's something that, in fact, is felonious to do. And the logic being that if you look at cases that are all alike on the dependent variable, then you have no idea of whether cases that are unsuccessful in this have the same attributes. So you don't have enough variance on the to be able to really say anything about success and failure in that case. So another point to make about all this is that and Guillaume were quite rightly made the difference between probabilistic and deterministic studies, and therefore between quant and quantitative and qualitative studies. But what we don't do enough of in comparative studies and social sciences in general is trying to triangulate, that is, to use multiple methods, multiple theories to deal with the same issue. There's a classic article in the APSR by Lieberson on doing this with quantitative and qualitative methods. And the other person who's written a lot about this was my late colleague, Bill Dunn, what he called critical multiplism. Now, it's usually associated with theory. So if you've ever read Graham Allison's great book on the Cuban Missile Crisis, he's essentially triangulating what went on in the Cuban Missile Crisis with three theories, using the same method, i.e. largely elite interviewing, and using available data to look at the Cuban Missile Crisis. But we also should do this for method as well, particularly moving between small n and large n studies. That is also means implying moving between probabilistic and deterministic studies. So, I mean, Lieberson, for example, talks that you could use a regression analysis to find what the seeming relationship is between variables. But what becomes important then is to look at the outliers. That is, all the countries that fall on or near the regression line basically aren't very interesting. The ones that are really interesting are those that fall above or below the regression line by a significant amount. So then you go to those and do small n studies, trying to refine your model. And then you go back to the large n. So you're just moving back and forth between quantitative and qualitative then enables you to find not only does X cause Y, but also have a much better idea of why the two variables are related. Now, that's expensive and time consuming and takes a variety of different skills, but it's also important. Let's see, what else? And I had one other point I wanted to make before. Oh, and I think it's a big one, is the role of theory. And again, Guillaume alluded to this. First of all, theory tells us in part what's most similar and what's most different. Most policy theory, I would argue, is not really comparative per se, that it doesn't essentially try to take the attributes of the system to compare the differences in the results. Now, that's probably a too strong a claim, but we haven't done as good a job of linking comparative politics, comparative economics, comparative sociology with policy studies as we might. Yeah? And particularly, I think the arguments made about the global South. I think Iris was there. I don't think Jan was at the ICP, the Executive Committee of the International Public Policy Association about almost 2 years ago. We had a long discussion about why journals why the models that we use in most comparative work, quote unquote, don't work, unquote, in the global South. And so we need to think more then about the theories that we use, what they can do for us, and how we need to make them more comparative. And we need to focus on theories that focus on decision making rather than perhaps structural factors. And finally, I think so. I mean, there's all this is to some extent basic methodology. It's all first year grad student methodology in some ways, but it's still something that we need to continue to remember and continue to keep applying as we think through how we wanted to make policy studies or policy analysis more comparative And therefore, in terms of the consumers that Guillaume talked about at the end, make it also more useful. So I'll stop there. Thanks.
Thank you, Professor Guy Peters. Yeah, this is very concise overview of comparative, and particularly comparative case studies as a methods for policy analysis, and the importance of case selection to make compelling arguments about a causal relationship, and the need to for a mixed method approach that combines qualitative and quantitative, combines large and small n, and combines probabilistic and deterministic approaches. And the importance of theory to guide our case selections and research design. I'm not sure if Iris is with us right now. Oh, yes. Okay.
I didn't want to take too much space. I'm here, of course. Yes.
Okay. Okay. So now the floor is yours.
Okay. So quite a lot has been said already. So I will relate to the more mundane aspects of public policy and why is it important or we want to compare in public policy. I don't know if Doreen is there with a slide that I asked her to put up because I had a problem doing that. And that was citing what, but it's not important, was citing what Guillaume already referred to. It was Swanson saying, thinking without comparisons is unthinkable. And in the absence of comparisons, so are our scientific thought and scientific research. So I think that Guillaume and Guy had, okay, thank you, had referred to that. It's not necessary anymore, that's fine. And comparisons, in point of fact, comparisons, whether implicit or explicit, prevail both in the daily life. I mean, everything we do, don't we compare which film is better than the other? Or what to shop because it's cheaper or better quality. It's really an intrinsic part of daily life, of life in general, but it's also part of the work of social scientists. And here we get to the types of research. Whether in research we have the experimental and the control methodology, right? Which the core is comparative, right? It allows us to experiment and have a control group and accordingly reach conclusions that are basically the result of comparisons. In practice, what happens in the field, say in governmental units or agencies and so on, people are looking for what has been done elsewhere. We have the and in both cases, what we have, we go back to Mills. What is the most similar or most different phenomena or procedure, phenomena if we speak about research, or procedure that has been undertaken elsewhere? So we take these two perspectives of the most similar and most different, in order, in practice, to lesson draw. And here we get to the practice side of it. Here we are trying, if we're talking about public policy in general, we are trying to identify those fundamental problems and emulate coping strategies in order to avoid, to improve what we are doing, or to avoid errors that in real life, in the public service, would save a lot of money and a lot of time. Why has policy analysis or public policy have stepped into this uncharted in the 1990s field of comparative public policy? If nothing else, public policy comparisons, whether through experimentation or not, lead to lesson drawing. There is the famous book by Rose, which called Lesson Drawing, which was really important stepping stone in the field of comparative public policy. Then you have in 1998, in the first issue of the journal, Peter de Leon and Resnick, and they identify types of lesson drawing. And they talk about transfer, that is, you learn about what is being done about corruption in Argentina, and you apply it to Ecuador. You just transfer whatever procedure has been done. Or you are borrowing, means that you are taking parts of it in order to solve the problem. Then there is adoption. Again, it's very similar in a way to transfer. Transfer refers to the procedure. Adoption is more the process itself, or of adopting a procedure that, or a solution that might have solved the problem. You have adaptation, where you adapt a certain lesson drawn to the context in which you function. And a beautiful one that I liked very much is inspiration. Sometimes you don't adopt or adapt anything. You are just inspired by what has been done, and you apply it in your context. There's a long list of people, the scholars who talk about it, especially about the need to adapt whatever is out there to the context. You have Swedlow, you have Hope, you have Drake, you have myself, and others. What is the branch of lesson drawing in public policy studies and policy analysis? And why is it an important reason and contribution of the comparative method? And the response is that primarily we are trying to depict and focus on circumstances in which the domains or social units being compared have in common a certain causal interaction or interactions between their respective dependent and independent variables. It is not enough that I had a sabbatical in France and I live in the US and I have a colleague with whom I'd like to work, and then let's compare healthcare policies. No, it doesn't really work this way. We need to get to the core of the causal interconnection leading to a certain policy problem, and therefore find the mitigating procedures that have been undertaken that, if they apply to the causal connections between the variables in my policy problem, I would be looking into. In fact, these policy variables are bound together by the necessity to reach policy solutions, right? That's the basic. We have problem, have solution, okay? And there is a process of policy analysis in between. So they are bound together by the necessity to reach policy solutions to real life policy problem. So in this respect, we have, I mean, on the one hand, we have the school of thought that talks about the fact that context matter, Laswell, 1950, that context is all important, he said. And therefore, the particular structure within which we bring in whichever lesson drawn depends on the culture or the politics or the resources of a certain social unit, which is under scrutiny. But on the other hand, so we have the context matter, but then Ingram says that similarities are more prevailing than differences, and that in fact, this is what explained the quest for comparisons. So if the causal relations between the variables of a problem are similar, then what matters is the similarities, and therefore we can go ahead with the comparison. But what is layered on top of this, in fact, is that once you've done that, pay attention to context, because context matter. And here we go back to De Leon, who in fact discusses the fact that there are levels of comparison, right? From full adoption to inspiration. There are, I will not talk about, I don't know if we have the time to talk about the development of the field. We'll leave it for another talk. But what I would like to discuss, in how many minutes do I still have, Jeline?
In total, we have 30 minutes left.
Okay, so I should be tying up.
Quick.
Let me see. I would talk about two types or two levels. Can I have 5 minutes?
Yeah, of course.
Okay.
Yeah, of course.
There are two levels of comparisons. There is the macro level in which comparative policy analysis operates, which relates to those macro underlying principles that hold foundational universal truths, allowing to promote the international discourse. For instance, the impact of globalization, understanding reform theory, approaches to democratic principles, right? These are big words, and I'm talking in words, but they are universal truths that we are trying to test and see how they are applied in our context and what the similarities or differences are. On the other hand, when we actually start working on it, we are looking at the micro level. And that refers to issues such as a policy's aim, when we compare what was the aim of a particular policy or the application of a reform in a certain context. Because if the aims are not comparable, whether similar or different, then what are we comparing? There could be agenda setting, what has triggered a certain policy problem. So as I believe Guillaume was referring to, we are looking into those cases, basically, where a policy problem takes place and where solutions are being sought, and how do we get there? What do we usually compare? We compare themes of common interest, ranging from budgetary reform to immigration policy, healthcare policy, and so on. We observe and analyze international and local trends leading to policy developments. We are looking mostly in research, less so probably in practice, into applicable models to explain developments. Take, for instance, Kingdon's policy streams, Kahneman's risk theory, and so on and so forth, to what extent these apply in those contexts. We are comparing and using performance indicators to compare across contexts. Take, for instance, the OECD studies on higher education, right? Applying criteria for efficiency for higher education performance. We are even, and I'm saying even, but that's a very important aspect. We are looking into those pitfalls or shortcomings or affecting factors of a policy within their administrative context and the way they had affected that particular context, and would that apply for the other compared with context. And I think that, and I think I will, I can talk forever, obviously, but I think that the main question that we should ask is what is the value added of the comparisons that we are undertaking? Does it lead to any universal truths, in which case it would be closer to policy research? Or are we trying to solve a policy problem, in which case we are looking for solutions and the process towards those solutions? I do not have the time to get into those, but I will close here. And I would leave the questions as food of thought or further discussion. Thank you very much for being here.
Thank you, Iris. It's this really challenges us to how to think about the purpose of doing comparative policy analysis, to think about how it relates to context and how it impacts the practice and lesson drawing. Thank you very much. I have so many notes and questions myself, and sort of links back to my own teaching of research methodology in my school, and also back to the many exchanges that I have had with Iris, and also the keynote speeches that Guillaume and Guy gave at the JCPA conference last year. Again, a lot of insights. But I still let me open the floor. So I'm going to I'm not going to ask my own question. Let me open the floor to our audience. And I'm already seeing a hand raise up. Michael?
Yes, thanks for calling on me. This is a really rich discussion on really basic issues, and it's great to have that opportunity. I was, I think, clearly, I'd like to more pick up with where Iris was going and maybe have that go back to the other discussion. I think, there's clearly an interest in researching phenomena and knowing something about phenomena across many different contexts and so on and so forth, where the idea is to understand, to know, whatever the specific thing you're interested in. And then there's an interest in what has been called lesson drawing here because it relates to actual problem solving. So it's great we're interested in both those things. Maybe we could have somewhat better vocabulary for the different things so that we can articulate some of the difficulties in doing kind of both within the field. So in my teaching, I struggle with finding just the right vocabulary for this because I'm in a social science university, but I'm very much trying to develop people's understanding and skill to solve problems. And there is a vocabulary issue. So one thing that I've come up with for the what has been called sort of the lesson drawing part, the practical part, is domain knowledge. And you might think of that as a kind of target for the sort of results of the various inquiries that we engage in, not necessarily the only one you would want, but if you're kind of in Iris's camp, that might be a good one. And so domain knowledge is more of a design idea, and it's sort of the sum total of things you'd want to be aware of to be fluent in if you're going to solve a particular problem. So it can be, let's call it theoretical ideas about how things are, but it also can be these little bits of former undertakings of the same kind, like seem to come up in some of the literature Iris was talking about. But it can also be something more like a framework, empirically informed framework, which kind of poses and addresses questions about kinds of practical matters, not particular practical matters, and gives some propositions for what the solution might be like and how you might get there. So I think, Iris, that you could say you're asking for a way to talk about creating domain knowledge in this field. I mean, this actually goes back to maybe some really old distinctions, even before Leipart, between two kinds of discussions. Cicero made a distinction between addressing questions of knowledge, like is the world governed by providence, and questions of action, like should we join the government? And I think what's nice about our field is we are interested in both. And so one of the real issues is if you're interested in questions of action, not necessarily in particular cases, but for kinds of questions of action, what are we going to do by way of research? And I think having a clear target about the kind of domain knowledge we want to enhance relative to what's out there now could help here, because then you're doing some, remedial work on what it is that in the academy we take to be reasonable propositions about how to solve a problem or what a solution would be. And I should probably stop here, but I think my concern here is that the discussion of comparison isn't very closely connected to this other discussion. It's not contradictory, but if I think there may be a tendency to want to use the comparisons to support something like what some people call technological rules of what would absolutely be the right approach to solving a problem. And if so, I think that is then something that you could debate as to whether that is really the kind of domain knowledge you only want to have. So generally speaking, wouldn't it be good to have a category for what kind of academic knowledge that addresses questions of action for kinds of practical matters, and we can use domain knowledge for that, and we can be open to a discussion of what research could be like if that's our primary target, to enhance domain knowledge about kinds of practical issues that are in our field. Thanks.
Can I step in? Yeah, that's how you want it. Question to you. What do you refer to when you speak about domain? Do you speak about domain as the domain of comparative public policy and developing a language for it, a lingo for it? Or do you speak about domain as the disciplinary domains, such as immigration, environment, infrastructure development? Each one have their own lingo and their own specifics on which, so it's really a domain upon a domain, and how do we really handle the differences and the opportunities that each one of them provides to the field? Michael, can you?
I'll give a brief answer. I don't want to miss
I
this.
might not have,
But,
yeah.
but it's closer to your second, yeah. I think that disciplines can identify with certain domains. Okay, they don't have to be narrowed to one, topic like you're talking about. But for me, public management is a discipline and it has a domain. Implementing public programs broadly, you can narrow that down. So yeah, it has to be knowledge that would be of interest to people solving problems, and it should be knowledge, should be a domain that you can associate with a discipline. I think those are two constraints to satisfy. So that wouldn't be your first option.
So we're closer to our workshop in Rotterdam in about 10 days.
For which I haven't had the invitation yet. So
you have it. We are organizing it. You haven't had the invitation yet? Oh my God. Okay, it will be taken care of today. Sorry about that, Michael. Thank you for telling me.
Yeah, if I could jump in, just to link back to Guillaume and Guy's presentations, I think domain knowledge is not just related to actions and practices. It also links to, for example, it also helps with case selections. You have to have the domain knowledge to really select the right cases out of the vast number of cases that are available. And also, I think I remember Guillaume also mentioned comparison, not just as cross-country comparison, but also cross-sectoral policy comparison. And that also requires domain knowledge to really understand multiple sectors, policy sectors, and then to really have the right kind of comparison. So I wonder if Guillaume and Guy have any thoughts about sort of the theory and practice, and also like domain knowledge and disciplinary knowledge.
Guy, would you like to go ahead? I'll start. Maybe there's a missing point that should be probably the context of our discussion, because obviously we did not talk about epistemology. Right. In the book we just finished, we came to a conclusion that precisely the idea of comparative policy analysis, as opposed to comparative studies, into many theories of the policy process is an epistemology. It's not just a method, and it's not just a theory. It's a way of thinking both the world and public policy within the world as phenomenon and relations of power, spaces where different stakeholders and different collectivities engage, either in cooperation, in conflict, or in co-governance, which is one of our favorite topic. I'm referring to Guy. And so when we think about comparative policy analysis as an episteme, it becomes much more simple, the discussion. It's simpler because first, we don't think about comparison in abstract, and we don't have to go back to, I don't know, Thomas d'Aquin, the four causalities. We can simply search for the best contributions, and we actually go back to the mid-19th century with John Stuart Mill, the good recipes to compare, but for what we are comparing, which are public policies. So I don't know if it answers the question of action and practice, but to me, it's much more practical than that. When I look at corruption as a social phenomenon, I can see many different epistemologies. I can look at it from political economy, which is basically the mainstream in corruption studies, or I can look at it as from the behavioral sociology, which is another episteme, and I can look at it from public policy. And I think it's probably a good point to start before we discuss on methodological strategies and techniques. And last but not least, we should also think about what Peter Hall called the alignment between ontology and methodology.
Right.
I was underlining that we can do QCA with RCT, we can combine techniques, but we always have to be very careful, and that's part of the problem of multi-methods today. That's a real discussion that we have with a few colleagues who are working hard on mixed methods and theories of methods, that by mixing up too many techniques, we kind of lose sight of the alignment. And we try to measure temperature with the meter, and obviously that would not raise good results.
It would present results. The only problem is their reliability and validity, right?
Yeah.
Because one of the issues in comparative public policy is that you see studies which have nothing to do with anything else, right? And that at the end of the discourse of about 20 pages, there is nothing that you can say that has any added value either to the field or to the problem. It's just a narrative of an observation, I would say.
I think Guy might have something to add. Your mic is off.
I'm trying to, there it is. Okay. Yeah, I think that maybe, in fact, the problem with focusing so much on domain knowledge, with all respect, Michael, is that we begin to narrow things down so much that we know everything about one narrow part of the world, and without thinking about how it fits with everything else. So one thing we didn't talk about here, which I think is increasingly important in policy analysis and policy studies, is the complexity, the interactions. So I think the example you gave about you having to know multiple domains. So maybe you need to know multiple domains because you're interested in something like policy coordination, which I am. So you need to know how domain X and domain Y can work together, or perhaps not effectively. So I think, at the same time, it's good to narrow, but we have to keep, I think, a broader perspective as well.
Well, in fact, if we look at the development, and I've been doing policy analysis since very, very, very early 90s, and was connected, and I'm still connected with APAM, the American Public Management and Policy Analysis Association, which was founded around the start of policy analysis as a field of study, and it has developed over years. I had a methodology book with Wildavsky. Now there's another one going out this week. The field has shifted along the line that Michael has mentioned, from a very methodology-oriented domain looking to speak truth to power through evidence that is gathered through and modeled through certain methodologies, to niches of expertise. If you look today into who comes to the gatherings of the of APAM, right? You would see experts in poverty, education, energy, climate change, and so on. And the same happens out there in the field. And I think that this is, if I'm not mistaken, what Michael was trying to point to, that because these niches within fields are so very much developed and sought, there are no longer policy analysts per se, but there are experts in certain domains doing policy analysis. And going a step further, doing comparative policy analysis if they want or need to, or are inclined to adopt.
We have 5 minutes left, so if I think we can accommodate maybe one more comments, questions from the audience.
I have a question.
Okay.
To you.
Go ahead.
To the moderator. No, my
to
question,
me?
Yeah, exactly. Because I think you have a role in that discussion that is very important, and that is, how would you see precisely the Iris was talking about the added value of comparison from your perspective, from your experience of comparison, of comparing public policy.
For me as the moderator, or for me as...
Yeah, because I think it's part of the conducting series of those lectures, and that would be partly one of the issues that we should address from the editorial line of the JCPA. Because it's one of the questions I keep asking myself: what are we useful for? What is the social utility of a journal of comparative policy analysis for theory and practice? Because that's the subtitle. And I think you know a lot about that.
Yeah. Well, I'm not sure
you have a lot to say about
I know
that.
much, but I'm still in the sort of a learning process. But my takeaway is as both you and Guy mentioned, one could say that all scientific inquiry is done through comparison. So in that case, in that sense, why do we still need a journal that is called Journal of Comparative Policy Analysis? But I think it's as you said, it's a way of looking at. It's an epistemology, is an angle of observing a policy phenomenon, and I'm from China, so essentially a lot of theories, just from my perspective, maybe it sort of represents a lot of scholars here today that are outside of sort of the so-called quote unquote mainstream from a lot of the existing policy theories, that it's a comparison. You have to transfer a lot of the so-called mainstream conventional theories to a different context. You mentioned context that matters. To Latin America, to China, to India, and then there is and that sort of necessitates a comparative perspective, even if this is not a cross-country comparison. And I see comparison a sort of more explicit comparative as an angle is a way to revisit an existing theory. And that does it's broader than cross-country comparison, I think. And it also applies to extending an existing theory that has been generated from one particular policy sector to another sector that you mentioned about sectoral comparison. So that's one thing. And also the title has both research and practice. It's also very intriguing that all of you have just discussed. I don't have specific answers, but I know that this is the essence of policy analysis, a discipline, right? It's a practical. It's oftentimes it stems from a specific policy problem, but then you have to take it to a more abstract level of broader sort of scientific inquiry. I don't have the answer. It's just I don't think I answered your question, but yeah. Monica.
Thank you very much. Let me have a little word. I very much appreciate that Iris brought in the word context, because that's what was missing in the first two talks. Everybody, our two speakers first talked about the system that's very open and it's all very difficult, many factors. And that depends, in my opinion, very much from the context where the case is in, or the context that is describes the country, if we go by national comparison. So I don't know how we can formalize or make a sort of methodological rigor to study what we take in from the context, because people take in from the context. Let's say they compare, I don't know, health policy or military stuff. They will take out of they will explain the differences already by the case selection, and then by the explanations after they have studied with all the data. They will pick out of the context what they either know or what they like. And nothing of this is very sort of methodologically. I can give you an example. The French have this idea, it's written in many books. The welfare state was set up after the Second World War. But it's not really true, because that's in the history, people know it too. It's after the First World War. And they say because there was a war and because we had to have solidarity and so on. But the real reason is there were attempts to put up a welfare state, or at least a health insurance, many, many years before, in the 19th century. And they didn't work because the actors were not ready, and nobody really wanted it, and nobody really understood it, except those very bright people, doctors in general, and a few humanitarian politicians, and they couldn't get anywhere. And it suddenly happened because they won the First World War, and Elsass-Lothringen came back to France, and they were formerly under German rule and had a social health insurance since Bismarck. And France couldn't solve the problem with this population and the regions coming back into the country. And they didn't want to lose their social security, which they had under the Germans. But France was not ready, and there was a huge opposition, even from the left. They considered this was a capitalistic stealing money from the workers. But this is totally forgotten. But the real fact why we have today such a lot of problems managing our social insurances in France is because we still don't have the management capacity and the social participation, because that was not built up in those days. It was just put together. We took something from Bismarck because there was a political need and the actors were not ready. And then the doctors opposed what was done, and it all went. I can see the historical sources, but this is, I don't know, when you ask people what is wrong with the system, they will say, well, it's too centralized, or there's too much privatization, there's not enough money, and they can document it with data, which is correct data. But the real reasons are completely different. It's a long past of institutions, and I think every country can find something. Whilst I listened to you, I had this idea, what about comparing the social participation, how citizens participate in public policy? It's a nice subject. How it works, how it's successful or not, in which cases, between China, the US under Trump, and some European country, Denmark or France. And just imagine the theory they will build up from this. And, it will be all wrong because they won't understand the context rightly. They will say in China, there is no participation because there's a Communist Party, which is completely wrong. There is participation. We visited this wonderful citizen center. And well, in France, we have a lot of participation. There's always demonstrations, but it doesn't get to any real result, and so on. So I just wanted to make this point about context. And I think there are things we can't really compare because we don't have the way of, tackling the context problem, because the context is is shaping the policy problem in the way Guy Peters understands this word, the policy problem. The problem politicians have to solve, how it is and what you can do. And that depends very largely from the context. And when you then compare two policy sectors or different countries, you have this problem. So for the next discussion, maybe the context problem. That's all I wanted to say. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you. You have a wonderful research idea, very ambitious research proposal. We are already 6 minutes behind our schedule. I don't know. I just saw Victor had turned off the videos. I don't know if Victor do you still want to give the final comments or? Victor, your mic is off. Yeah, go ahead.
We've really run over time, but I found this a most instructive, very interesting review of many issues I haven't thought about in many years. I've been focusing on what Michael Barsley calls the domain, although I think I would call it the substantive area. And I like Iris's last point. Well, I like many of the points. Monica's point I would call history. We need to bring in history in any comparison as well. That's another way of looking at context. But Iris's last point on the specialization that has taken place in the field, which means that we have experts in every area of substantive knowledge: criminal justice, healthcare, education, climate. And within each of these substantive areas, there are people who never do comparative analysis. And then there's this emerging field within the substantive areas. I think that's what Michael Barsley calls the domain, or it's one aspect of the domain, a substantive area, where people are increasingly doing comparative analysis. I think that's a very promising area in which to develop the field in a practical kind of way. And I'll leave you with just one other book. So many books have been cited in relation to what Iris said at the end, pragmatism. The book by Donald Schoen called The Reflective Practitioner, which has some interesting case studies on practice and theory across a number of different, if I may say, domains or substantive areas. But that's all for another discussion. Thank you. Thank you for this very interesting discussion of both theory and practical issues.
Yeah. Thank you, Victor, for your kind words. I would like to conclude by making a proposal. I can see that we have actually chosen the wrong title for this event. We started with comparative methods, but I can see this is it's less about the comparative methods as skills and techniques itself. It's about methodology, and it's about how the ontology and epistemology guides the methodological choices. And so I'm going to make a proposal and see, because we are planning this virtual lectures as an event series. So I can see there are more questions that we still would like to discuss. And if that is possible, and particularly Guillaume and Iris, when your book is finally comes out, maybe we should have a discussion about epistemology in comparative policy analysis, and sort of that actually should have been the first event before we talk about methods.
Yeah, but the book is not out yet, so how can we talk about
I know. So maybe so or when it's about to come out, we need to have a discussion.
It's with the publisher already. It's with the publisher.
So yeah, so it's going to come out this year. So maybe I think that the way that we look at policy analysis and comparative policy analysis as epistemology is a more fundamental question, as Guillaume said.
Well,
and also, go ahead.
No, just to add up to what Iris just said, it's not a problem to go in a sequence from the highest abstraction to the most practical, precisely because you see the utility, the added value I was referring to, of a more philosophical approach to comparative analysis when you've met with the challenges of methods, basically. So it's not a bad thing that we started talking about methods before we go back to epistemology.
Right. Thank you very much. And particularly special thanks to Guillaume and Iris, Guy, who has left, and Michael, Victor, and Monica, and everybody who have joined us for this very inspiring discussion that has left us with more questions than fewer. But
that means that it was a good one.
Yeah. That shows it's a good discussion, and I'm taking away a lot of new ideas for future virtual lectures. And please, we'll keep you posted once we have future events planned. So thank you very much. Have a good day. Have a good night.
Thank you very much for organizing it, Jolene. Bye-bye. All the best.
Bye-bye.
Wonderful. Bye.
Bye.